I'm Luca Giliberti, contributing writer for Gold Derby, and I'm joined today by Emmy-nominated editor Matthew Barbato to talk about Apple TV Plus's new limited series, Lessons in Chemistry. And Matthew, to start things off, I'd be very curious to hear from you what those initial conversations were like with Lee Eisenberg, the showrunner, with Sarah Adina Smith, the director of the first two episodes, which you edited, in terms of what you wanted the rhythm and the tone of these first two
Right.
installments to be like.
Well, when we first talked about the episodes before they were shot and as they were being shot, we all sort of knew that there'd be some experimentation involved in the post process and in editing. So what Sarah did and what Lee did is they provided us with a great framework and a lot of great material. And once we got into the edit, we were able to sort of play around, and we had the freedom to kind of find the moments that we needed and the rhythm that we needed. And Sarah had worked really hard with Brie and with Lewis to
Mhm.
really develop those characters' personalities, because they are unique protagonists and unique characters. And so it was really calibrating a really specific performance from each of them to make them really stand out and really be compelling characters. And it's everybody knows that it's tough to do adaptations, and
Yeah.
so on one hand you want to be as hew as close to the source material as possible, but you shouldn't be constrained by the material and in order to make the piece that you need to make. And so I think that what we were all trying to do, especially in the beginning, was just find the best show and figure out the best way to honor the source material in the book and make the best characters and the best story we could.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what's interesting about your episodes, you also edited the seventh, which I have seen, but we unfortunately can't talk about yet because it's not out yet. But what's interesting about them is that they really chart Elizabeth and Calvin's entire relationship, basically. So how did you ensure that the progression of their relationship didn't feel rushed? And how did you decide, when to slow things down a bit so that we could really be in the moment with them, where moments between them could really breathe?
Yeah, it was I think the series was being written as it was being shot, and so
Hmm.
that gave Lee and Sarah the opportunity to adjust things into the future and add things in. And I think we've seen enough episodes now to know that Calvin doesn't completely disappear.
Exactly.
Uh, and that's because the strength of the relationship that was portrayed between those two actors was so strong, and it was such a big, important part of the story. And so we did take a lot of time and put a lot of attention on how quickly to get to that relationship, how to preserve a certain momentum with it. I always say that in editing and in storytelling, you have a need and a desire to create a momentum and give an audience more information on a certain level, and you have this tension where you also are trying to withhold it. And typically in a first episode of a season, whether it's a pilot or even if it's not a pilot, if it's you're going to do the rest of it, there's a lot of experimentation that you have to do, because the instinct is always to put too much information in the front. You want the audience to know all of these things so that they can know what's happening in subsequent scenes. But you really have to figure out how to parse that out in the right amount so that you don't overwhelm people, and that you are just giving the audience the information that they need as they go. So there was a good amount of experimentation and restructuring and things like that. And hopefully we found a good place, good medium ground.
Oh, absolutely. Because, watching that relationship unfold or play out really felt like an odyssey to me. Because as viewers, we really do get to sit with them in so many moments. And even if you think about that montage in the first episode, in which Elizabeth is trying to perfect all these different or try out all these different recipes, and then she sort of brings them to work so that Calvin can try them. I feel like it's therein that we start to see their relationship blossom. And I think that's sort of an interesting thing to balance, on the one hand, her cooking, and then also this blossoming relationship. So how did you approach that montage, for example?
Uh, that was, My director, Sarah Adina Smith, had just shot a lot of great material. And with montages, it's really always a matter of how much time before you're sort of overstaying your welcome.
Mhm.
And so with that, you know, a lot of those things start out a lot longer than they are going to be in the end. And so, you know, I tried to make the best montage I could. And then as we looked at it, we started to kind of trim it down to just its essentials. And, you know, the moment right before that, that leads into that is when she realizes that he could be someone that she could talk to. And there's this kind of performance moment on Brie's face where she's hesitant, and then she opens up, and now she's found a someone she can relate to.
Mhm.
And so it was a really beautiful starting off point for that montage, because then we could just show how people fall for each other. And the performance is a lot. What I love about a performance like that or a montage like that is it's that's not in the text, it's in the performance.
Yes.
It's in how they're reacting to one another. And, you know, they're talking about science, but that's not really what they're doing.
Exactly.
You know, they're finding each other, and that's just their medium. And I wanted to say this because I did another event one, and I never got to say this, but there's
Mhm.
this montage, and Sarah had shot so much material that the montage was essentially of, this is when Elizabeth is cooking the lasagna.
Mhm.
In the first episode, we see it, and she comes home and she's a little sad, and she puts some lasagna in the oven and it's done. The original version of that was essentially a cooking show on its own. It was
Really.
probably 3 minutes long. It had every step. It was scored front to end, and it was just this enormous thing. And it was in the episode almost to the very end, until we realized that we had a beautiful montage, the one we're talking about. And so it was a little heartbreaking for me because I'd put a lot of work into it, but it was certainly the right thing to do, is to reduce that moment.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, you never want to overstay your welcome. And sometimes when you have a montage in an episode, then having a second one, sometimes that just sort of messes with the rhythm and the momentum of the episode, doesn't it? I feel like
Yeah,
that's,
absolutely.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing that. That's really interesting to hear. And before we move on to another aspect, I do want to talk about the ending of episode 2, in which Calvin is tragically hit and killed by a bus. And I really feel like it's the editing in this scene that really sells the shock, the utter shock of that moment. So talk about the process of putting that scene together, and also choosing the right moment to then cut to the credits.
Yeah, that actually, well, firstly, let me acknowledge that episode 2 was co-edited with my partner, who's been
Hmm.
working with me for a long time, Jack Cunningham. And Jack cut that scene. He cut it originally, and it mostly stayed the way, we talked about it a lot, because that was our big concern, is that, are we giving something away? Are we creating a sense of tension that people are expecting it? And so essentially, he did a really great job on it. And it's more or less what we see in the show as it broadcasts. I think we trimmed it a little bit, and we changed a few of the shots to just try and give us the sense that we were just enjoying Calvin's joy,
Hmm.
that he was in that moment. And then once they stop and they're, having the tug of war, that needed to be pretty condensed and pretty precise, because if we did it too long, it really is an instinctual thing. Like, where do you feel like you're telling the audience, oh, something's about to happen? Once, Calvin is hit by the bus, there was a lot of discussion about how to play the next beat.
Hmm.
And, we had score come in right away to, create a sad moment. We thought it was more impactful to do it with natural sound.
Hmm.
And then when we were in the mix, we were debating how long to keep the natural sound. Should it just be all natural sound for the entire credits? And I have to say that I argue that we should bring the score in at some point, because I feel like in a lot of TV series nowadays, if you don't see the result of an injury or something, you're not sure are they trying to pull a fast one on us? And I
Yeah,
felt
yeah.
like unless we put in the funereal score, the
Mm,
audience might feel like, oh, I don't know, is he still alive? What's going to happen? But I thought we should. That's not a game that we wanted to play at that point. So the
mm.
natural ambient sound was fantastic and really affecting. But I thought at a certain point we needed to bring in some really sad music to let the audience know, like, oh, what we just thought we saw is what we really saw. And so I managed to persuade the room because there was a lot of different opinions on that. And so, yeah, but it was interesting because it's funny when you bring up moments like that, they are things that we debated in the edit room for weeks.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting that you debated about something that, not, it's not even small, but it is something that a lot of people may not even think about. So I love that you mentioned it because you're completely right. At this point, until we actually see someone announced dead on a show, it's hard to believe it at this point. So I really think that that touch is really, really interesting. Um,
I'm still having arguments with my son about Succession, whether we're supposed to know he was dead or not. I didn't because I keep feeling like with Game of Thrones and things, it's like I don't know if and even if you see him dead, they might come back to life. Who knows?
exactly. We all watched Jon Snow come back, so you don't know what to believe. Um,
Right.
Yeah. And another arc that kind of plays out in these first two episodes is what happens to Elizabeth in 1950. Namely, she's sexually assaulted by her lab advisor, and this is first alluded to or foreshadowed in the first episode through these like flashes of memory that Elizabeth has at certain moments. And I'd be interested to hear from you, why it was important to everyone to even include these flashes to begin with, and how did you then ensure that they didn't take away from what Brie Larson was already delivering with her performance, if that makes sense?
I do. You're asking interesting questions because this was also the subject of a lot of debate. Those
Mm,
flashes were added in after the initial shoot, and there was a lot of debate. I mean, obviously, the subject matter everyone wanted very much to honor, be respectful and do it properly and not gratuitously.
yes.
Um, in terms of the flashbacks, it was a big discussion amongst everybody with differing opinions about whether or not we were registering her trauma and her PTSD responses. And we wanted to make sure that the audience understood it. And I'll be frank, I thought we had it with what Brie gave us in the original. And I was arguing a little bit that we should leave it like that. Once they shot it and we tried it, and particularly on my latest screening of it, when we had a screening recently, I was very affected by the flashbacks, and I'm sold. I'm sold on it, and so it drives home the point. It spells it out a little bit more for people who might need a little bit more spelling out. We were there, two or three other moments in the episode that she has that reaction, and they're subtle little things, and we worked really hard to make sure that we weren't hitting the nail on the head too much, but
Hmm.
that we were making sure they came across. The flashbacks were the last thing to go in, and like I said, like I've been on both sides of the argument for that, and now
Yeah,
I'm a big.
yeah, I mean, it makes complete sense that, sometimes you do need a bit more spelling out, especially this is the first episode of the show we're talking about. This is not, we haven't spent 5 hours with her already. We're just getting to know her. So it really does make sense that you would want to spell it out a bit more, even if, like you said, Bree's performance, she already really delivers all of that and she already conveys all of that. But I think the approach makes a lot of sense. And you already mentioned the actual scene. Them, it's at the beginning of the second episode, and there's always a degree of difficulty that comes with any depiction of sexual assault on screen. So what was important to you and to everyone else when it came to the framing of this scene and then how it was ultimately stitched together?
Yeah, I personally, have strong feelings, like I'm sure most people do, about scenes of depicting sexual violence and whether or not they're done gratuitously or not. And so sitting down, I just got the footage. I had read the script, I got the footage, and I was just very personally concerned about not being gratuitous with it, but also you need to portray the horror of it because the reality of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And that scene is interesting in terms of editorially. That's a scene that both Jack, my co-editor, and I, we each did our own version of it, and without looking at each other's version. And then we looked at each other's, and they were pretty similar with some small differences. So we basically made a hybrid scene of it, but we both were on the same page in terms of and again, this is not something you can calibrate or talk about or write down in a book. Like, you just have an instinct, like, to bring it as far as you need to bring it, and that's it. So there's different choices that can be made with that footage, but it just really is just a matter of trying to get it just right, because it's not something that should be done frivolously.
Absolutely. And I think what you mentioned, you never want it to be gratuitous, but you also don't want to you don't want to look away either. And I think that's such a fine line to walk. And I feel like the show really does a great job with it. And on a final note, I do want to mention Harriet Sloan, played by the great Asia Naomi King, because from what I understand, she is reimagined from the book. And I guess the challenge with her storyline then becomes that, it seems a bit isolated from the main storyline at first, at least from Elizabeth's storyline. So how did you make sure then, for you and your co-editor, in the edit of the second episode, in which she's, that's when she's really introduced to us. How did you ensure that her storyline felt like it was really part of the narrative and carried the same amount of weight as Elizabeth's story?
Yeah, and that's another, you've hit on a lot of pieces that were debated, and and her storyline, there was a lot more information in the first episode originally, but then we were kind of spreading it out too much. So we ended up, I think, moving it to the second episode because it actually served it better. Because then we could give more bulk to it, and not just have it be this kind of check mark of like, oh, and don't forget about this character, she's going to come up later. Like, we could really use it appropriately. She's such a great actress. It's so fun to edit her material. Yeah, I think it was really, I'm trying to think back, because there's so many balls in the air with a show like this, and so many things to account for. And we did move things around, and it was important to us that she felt integrated into the show, and that it wasn't, and especially in episode 2, where it's essentially her being ignored. That's her storyline.
That's very true.
So how do you portray that and not make it feel like unimportant? But exactly. I think that by establishing her relationship as quickly as Lewis and Asia do, you just know that that's an important relationship. And so by him not being there for her is a big story point. And I think you feel it. And I think that just the way that we were able to figure out how to juxtapose those two stories of him, and you're cheering, you're rooting for him, he's falling in love, and it's great, but he's also letting someone down.
Exactly.
And that's a big part of it.
Yeah, I can, and you know what? It's just impossible. You already mentioned how good Asia is. I mean, she's so magnetic. It's impossible to look away. And I feel I was happy every time she was on screen. You just wait for her to come back on screen, and I think that's really powerful. I think that says something about the character, how she's written, how it's performed, how she's edited into the narrative. So I think it all turned out. Yeah, unfortunately, we're out of time. But thank you so much for walking me through your process. Really, really, really fascinating. And congratulations on this show.
Thank you so much, Luca.